I hate this meme. The curtains are blue meme. It is the worst meme and is directly related to the downfall of Western civilization. But I think that this meme is representative of a failure in our culture of appreciating art. I think a lot of people would benefit from giving art a chance and learning to appreciate it. Firstly, I do think it is important to look at why art is underappreciated in our society, and I think there are a couple reasons. Firstly, art is associated with pretentiousness, snobbery, self-righteousness, and gatekeeping, and that's pretty valid. People in the art world, regardless of what the art is, unfortunately have this culture of snobbery, and I think it's hurting the art world more than anything. But if you can dodge the douchebags who appreciate art in this way and surround yourself or consume content that is unrelated to this snobbery, you can find appreciation in the arts. Another reason why art is looked down upon is our association with uselessness and poverty. The stereotype that an arts degree is useless because the ROI on an arts degree is low, considering jobs aren't readily available for the art students like many other majors. In doing so, we have a stereotype about art majors that they are lazy, unmotivated, and don't contribute to society. While there are definitely lazy arts kids, I feel like that overgeneralization comes from our fixation on progress and monetary value in a post-industrial society. Thinking about college only as a monetary investment rather than a place to learn and advance one's understanding of their intended life goal, while also branching into philosophy, sociology, and every other branch of education that creates a well-rounded person. But our culture only focuses on industrial progress and financial gain. Along that same line, because of people's busy daily lives, many feel it a waste of time and energy to think so hard about something that doesn't affect their daily lives. But I feel that if you can learn to appreciate art in your own way, in a way that adapts to your lifestyle, it can be life-changing. The last main reason for this anti-art sentiment is due to a failure of our education system. In English or language arts class, we read the classics, and we're forced to read these boring books so we can pass a test, creating this negative association with reading. Not only that, we only learn stuff about thematics, grammar, and reading comprehension rather than any real explanation on why we should care. Why does any of this matter? What does any of this mean? Also, we read the classics rather than books that will actually make us care. We learn Shakespeare in high school when that is not an entry point for literary analysis. I'm a film studies major, and I fell in love with cinema by watching blockbuster movies like Jurassic Park and Jaws. Once I fell in love with the accessible content, I could sink my teeth into the art, and now I'm able to appreciate films like Un Chien Andalou and Meshes of the Afternoon, which are experimental, non-linear films that I wouldn't recommend unless you are deeply passionate about cinema and have the open-mindedness to explore new avenues of art. If I watched Un Chien Andalou and Meshes of the Afternoon before I watched Jurassic Park, I probably would have hated them and not pursued film any further. That is how I see Shakespeare being taught in grade school. You know who does like reading Shakespeare and analyzing his work? College English majors. And that is because they fell in love with literature and are able to dive deeper into the subject. People in grade school, even high school, have not been able to appreciate and love literature before they are thrown into complex and boring explorations of the world's most studied author. So they have no passion or drive to appreciate or care about Shakespeare's work. Going back to a previous point, teens in high school have been conditioned to not care about the arts, and that school is simply a stepping stone to getting a job and making money. Now, I am not implying that we stop teaching Shakespeare in school. Quite the opposite, actually. I just think the lead up to Shakespeare should be better. Just like how you need to learn algebra in order to learn calculus, but the emphasis on art in school has always been a struggle, but I will get to that later. Let's go back to this meme and break down what it is saying. The critique of the curtains being blue is an analysis of author's purpose. Essentially, what does the author intend for the audience to get out of the writing? In literature, the author meticulously decides every word and every adjective. I can assure you the author pondered over what colors to make the drapes, and landed on blue for one reason or another. Although the English teacher's analysis of the symbolism of the blue curtains may not be what the author intended, it does not inherently make it wrong. This meme also creates a hyperbolic dichotomy between the two statements, as if the only two ways to interpret this is either an extreme and unlikely symbolism or a complete rejection of analysis altogether. Normally when an author describes color, it is less to do with symbolism and more to do with creating the visualization in the reader's head. Choosing blue curtains is meant to visualize the inside, casting a cool and calm atmosphere in the books. The author used color not as symbolism, but to create a visual atmosphere in a medium that primarily lacks a visual element. Now let's look at what the supposed English teacher said. The English teacher's analysis is focused on symbolism of color, which I'll admit isn't my favorite form of media analysis. But in order to argue whether this is a good analysis or not, it would require more context of the book and not just dissecting a straw man fallacy of anti-intellectualism. But regardless of whether I agree or think this is a good analysis, it doesn't make this argument right or wrong, especially when framing it on what the author intended. Because it doesn't matter what the author intended necessarily. It only matters what the reader or audience feels during the piece of art. Death of the Author is one of the most important works written on media literacy. Barthes essentially argues that the author's purpose holds little value in media analysis. The importance and substance of a work of art rather is derived from the interpretation of each individual reader. Death of the Author essentially throws out the idea of author's purpose. Regardless of what the author intended for the product, it only matters what the impact is on the audience. With that in mind, this meme feels kind of stupid. Even if the author just meant for the curtains to be blue solely based on aesthetics, disregarding any symbolic intent, that doesn't necessarily matter. If you agree with the rhetoric of Death of the Author, then the English teacher is perfectly valid in her argument. The author's purpose is irrelevant. This school of thought makes sense. The intent of the artist shouldn't dictate the reaction of the audience. The reaction to a piece of art is the entire purpose of a piece of art. Most times, when consuming a piece of art, regardless of medium, we don't necessarily know the author's intent anyway. We can only infer it, which is essentially just our analysis of the work and thus not necessarily the author's purpose. Now, I don't 100% subscribe to Death of the Author. I'd say I 70% do, though. I think that understanding the author's intent may help guide the viewer into their own understanding. For example, The Crucible was a play written by Arthur Miller and was also adapted into a film. The Crucible is about the Salem witch trials, where one of the characters accuses the other people in the town of witchcraft, but the accuser completely fabricated the accusations in order to save face. The play itself is good and has themes about innocence and the judicial system, but if you know the author's purpose, the story takes on a whole new meaning. Arthur Miller wrote the play during the 50s during the Red Scare, which is essentially a time during the Cold War where the fear of communists infiltrating the US was so stark that the House Un-American Activities Committee was created to investigate people that identify as communists. This was particularly focused on artists and Hollywood, as the media of the time could influence the people of the US into being communists. So many artists, including playwright Arthur Miller, were called out as communists regardless of if there was any evidence that they subscribed to that belief or not. So Miller wrote The Crucible as an allegory about the Red Scare, where being a witch was equivalent to being a communist. Knowing this backstory about the playwright helps guide the audience into an understanding of the work of art, so the author's purpose does play a role in that case. However, it is not the only way to analyze a piece of work. It also doesn't have to be the intent of the author that influences the audience reactions. It can just be attributes about the artist. For example, the movie American Psycho is a satire on wealth and masculinity of the upper class. It portrays Patrick Bateman, a businessman who is able to get away with multiple homicides, partially due to his status and his gender, but it also looks at how fragile his masculinity is, where he gets insecure about the off-white coloring of a business card. The film is a masterclass in satire on fragile and toxic masculinity, the all-too-common abuse and disrespect towards women from the patriarchy, and the absurdity of wealth. Because gender is a major factor in the thematics of American Psycho, knowing that the film was directed by a woman changes the implications of some of the satire. So we didn't even need to know Mary Harron's purpose in directing American Psycho, all we needed to know was her gender, and that can help guide the audience to an understanding of the piece of art. So you might be saying, Sinjin, haven't you just contradicted yourself? Didn't you just say that regardless of what the author intended, the English teacher is still valid, but now you're saying it does matter what the artist intended? Well, my point actually is that there are a multitude of ways to approach art. There's no one-size-fits-all way to look at art. It is not required to know everything about the artwork in order to understand it, because not every piece of art will be presented in such a way. If you know nothing about painting and you browse an art gallery, you probably won't pick up on the influences of the artist. Unlike some people at the gallery, you probably wouldn't see a painting and point out the specific brushstroke techniques that the artist uses to convey the emotion. However, you can still have a reaction to the painting. You can see a painting by Caravaggio and be struck by its boldness, by its beauty. You can find the power in this painting without understanding any painting techniques he used. You can feel the drama in this painting even if you didn't know that this was Jesus and that this is a depiction of an actual story in the Bible. And if you stare at it long enough, you might even come to the same conclusions that people who study paintings will come to. Even an untrained eye might pick up on the use of lighting and the pose of Jesus to guide the eye from the right of the painting to the left. Even if you've never studied paintings, you will feel something if you look at this painting long enough. Even if you can't describe what makes it beautiful, you can probably look and just feel its beauty. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you look at this painting and are annoyed that it is not lit well enough. Or you might look at it and think it's just a painting of some guy pointing at another guy. And while I would disagree with you, that was your reaction and your interpretation of the work, so it's not necessarily wrong. The word discourse is used a lot in artistic interpretations, and that is because each person has their own interpretations, and they discuss within each other what their interpretations are. And this is all subjective. There's no right and wrong final interpretations. The whole discourse around art is that people present their objective statements about a work of art and combine it into a subjective interpretation, which is why two people can feel differently about a piece of art and neither necessarily be incorrect. I say all of this because if we go back to the curtains meme, this anti-intellectual standpoint that the student is on seems to disregard the intended analysis of the subject. Ironically, however, that anti-analysis standpoint is a genuine analysis that people can argue about art. The concept of art in general and its usefulness in society is a debated topic, and while I would argue against this point, it technically is an academic standpoint one can take against art. It is a common standpoint for lay people, specifically with art after the post-World Wars, like absurdism, surrealism, and abstract art. But going back to an earlier point, I feel like the reason is because of the way our industrialized school system teaches art. Essentially, when the Industrial Revolution happened, the concept of specialization set in. Before industrialization, most people had to do everything for themselves to survive. Each family knew how to cook, clean, sew, farm, build, etc. The family would build the house that they live in, harvest the crops, and gut the livestock for their own table. But once the Industrial Revolution sparked, it was more efficient for the workers to be specialized in one specific category. So now, instead of building your own house, you hire specialized construction workers and architects to build it. Instead of harvesting your own crops, you buy from specialized farmers. But because of specialization, industrialists needed a more educated population. They still wanted lower class workers, but they needed them to be at least literate. So they thought if we could teach the general population the base knowledge to get by, the classic reading, writing, and arithmetic, then they would be educated enough to enter the workforce in specialized categories. Now, in our late-stage capitalist world, many view school only as a stepping stone to work. You go to school not to learn, but to set yourself up to join the workforce. Because life in our economy is centered solely around monetary value, and personal value is linked with work and net worths. When thinking of school only as a stepping stone to the workforce, studying art seems worthless. Lady Macbeth's monologue will not aid you in your plumbing skills or your Excel skills. Starry Night will not help you ask for a raise or promotion. This line of thinking can also breach art and go into the classic reading, writing, and arithmetic. It fuels anti-intellectual ideologies, such as never needing to use the Pythagorean theorem in the real world, or that school is too focused on teaching quadrilaterals rather than how to do your taxes. The other line of thinking, however, is that knowledge is inherently valuable, and having an educated population cultivates a richer society. With this line of thinking, you don't think about the ROI of learning. The return on the investment is the fact that your life is now enriched with new knowledge. But our entire capitalist society is only focused on the monetary value of education, rather than seeing education as a value in itself. This applies to art as well. There is no emphasis placed on art being taught because it doesn't have any fiscal incentive. This is why music and theater programs are underfunded in almost every high school, and why art appreciation and media analysis aren't taken seriously as classes. But appreciating art isn't just one class that you take. It should be a concept that is taught over the years, just like math is, building upon itself. Because art is the most beautiful and human thing we have. And I think every person should be able to learn to love and appreciate art. If they appreciate it differently than I do, then that is even better. Perspectivism is a philosophical idea that perception of and knowledge of something are always bound to the interpretive perspectives of those observing it. Perspectivism is a major part of appreciating art and media analysis. Essentially, perspectivism within art is what I was getting at earlier, that each interpretation of a piece of art is technically valid. However, perspectivism doesn't mean that every perspective is true and of equal value. Not to diminish any perspective necessarily, but when analyzing art, it is important to be able to back up your claims on your perspective. If your perspective is that The Last Airbender movie is the best movie of all time, then you better have some serious claims to back up that statement. But if your defense is just, I don't know, it's pretty cool, then that wouldn't necessarily have the same value as an in-depth analysis of Citizen Kane. And I know that can sound pretentious, but I think it isn't necessarily pretentious. I think it only seems that way because of the elitist culture of the art world. But back to perspectivism, it doesn't just apply to analyses, it also applies to creating art itself. There's an incredible video by Nerdwriter1 about French painter Claude Monet and his 25 different paintings of a haystack. Essentially what Monet did was paint the same haystack during different times of the day, focusing on the different ways the sunlight casts shadows across it, how the hay reflects reds or yellows during some times, how the same image can represent different perspectives of the day, how even the same mundane thing changes into countless different things throughout the day, and that it was never the same. The haystack was never the same at any moment. The world is always changing, and not only does each person have a different perspective from other people, we have constantly changing and evolving perspectives, both perspectives on life as we age and the literal perspective we watch from. When you watch a movie when you're 12 and then again when you're 30, your perspective has changed, and so your reaction to the movie will change. The love scene may hit different now that you yourself have fallen in love. The death of a family member scene may hit different if you have now lost a loved one. Just like the haystack, just like the night sky, art ebbs and flows throughout everyone's life. It is never constant, and each time you approach a piece of art, it will be different. I think it's beautiful that each piece of art is just the culmination of every experience in the artist's life, combined with every experience of the audience member's life. It makes art this beautiful, unique phenomenon that can move and shape and change. It is a wonderful part of human psychology that is worthy of study and worthy of appreciation. To sum everything up, no, the curtains are not just blue. Unless you think they are.